Hello and welcome to AmericanNavalHistory.com. My name is John Sorensen, and I am making a series of lessons to teach the history of the United States Navy. Our Navy is a massive global force for good, and its history is our heritage. In this lesson, our new nation tries to remain neutral in the age-old European conflict between France and Great Britain, but does become involved with the fighting at sea. In the first part of this lesson, we talked about the Congress authorized the Department of the Navy as a separate branch of the government, and the Navy got the first Secretary of the Navy, and how that Secretary worked to build a larger fleet of ships. In this part, the second part of this lesson, we're going to look at the actual fighting of the war. In this war, there were very few actual battles, but all of those battles were fought by the Navy at sea. When the Navy Department was first established, Benjamin Stoddert was chosen as the first Secretary of the Navy. His role as Secretary of the Navy was to build and to purchase ships, contract for naval supplies, and to hire and train officers and crew. The Secretary of the Navy position was supposed to be back then what it is today, an administrative position. But Benjamin Stoddert, he took the initiative to develop the operational strategy for the war. Now, Stoddert's first priority in this war was to protect American merchant vessels at sea. You know, they were under constant threat and attack by the French Navy and from privateers. He set up convoys to have Navy ships sail with the merchant ships in the West Indies, because that's where most of the attacks and most of the threats were occurring, down in the West Indies. Now, his second priority was to hunt down enemy ships. Now, to do that, he set up 4 squadrons to patrol different areas of the West Indies. Now, he was so involved with the strategy of this war, and this war was strictly a Navy war, and he was the Secretary of the Navy, that this quasi-war with France, a lot of historians refer to this war as Stoddert's War. Now, here's a map of the Caribbean Sea, or the Caribbean Sea, however you want to pronounce it, and that's what we refer to as the West Indies. All the islands that make up the chain of islands coming off of Venezuela up that curls around to Puerto Rico and Hispaniola and Cuba. That's all what we call the West Indies now. But before we start looking at the 4 different squadrons and where they were and what they did, we need to consider that the French only had 2, 3, maybe 4 warships in this area during the entire war. Remember that France was at war with Great Britain at this time. So they were fighting 2 wars, and not that U.S. and Great Britain were great buddies, but we had a common enemy that we were both fighting. And the British had most of the French fleet bottled up in port in Brest, France, and they had that port blockaded so that none of the French fleet could get out. Now the 2, 3 ships that were in the West Indies were dealt with by the Americans quite well. But here's the way Stoddert had it divided up. He had Commodore Barry. Now remember Commodore Barry, he was the last officer decommissioned out of the Continental Navy, and he was the first officer commissioned into the United States Navy 9 years later. He had the largest area to contend with, but he also had two of the American big frigates, the 44-gun United States and the 44-gun USS Constitution. And there were 7 other smaller schooners in his fleet. Now, Squadron 2, that was Thomas Truxton's squadron. He had the USS Constellation. That was also a 44-gun schooner, and he had 4 other ships helping him patrol up there in the Squadron 2 area. Squadron 3 did the Windward Passage that was between Haiti and Cuba. You can see the S3 on the map. And Squadron 4 was Stephen Decatur Sr.'s area, and that's the whole north coast of Cuba, was dedicated to Squadron 4. Now, in this entire conflict, the United States Navy only lost one ship, and that was the USS Retaliation. And we'll talk a little bit about that, and its captain was Lieutenant William Bainbridge. And if you look at the slide here, down at the bottom, that's not the Retaliation. That's the ship that's in today's Navy, named after William Bainbridge. Very early in the war, in July 1798, the U.S. Navy captured its first prize, and that was a 12-gun privateer schooner named La Quasi which was a French privateer. It's a very small 12-gun ship, and it was captured by Stephen Decatur's father, who was also named Stephen Decatur. Okay, La Quasi was renamed the USS Retaliation. The Retaliation was given to Lieutenant William Bainbridge. And that was during the summer of 1798. Now, during the fall of 1798, Bainbridge was given a mission to go to Guadalupe, where two ships were seen, and he was supposed to go investigate, what these two ships were. And it turned out that they were two French frigates, very powerful warships. That were the 36-gun Insurgent and the 44-gun Volontaire. Now, remember, Bainbridge's Retaliation only had 12 guns. So he was very overwhelmingly outgunned. And he had no choice. He was outnumbered 2-1, and in guns, he was outnumbered, let me do the math here, 80-12. So he really had no chance, and he had no choice but to surrender, and that he did. Now, the USS Retaliation was the first U.S. Navy warship ever to surrender to an enemy force. But that wasn't the worst luck that Bainbridge ever had in his Navy career. And you have to wait until we discuss the war with the Barbary pirates to hear about even worse luck that he had later on in his career. Now, if there was a hero in this quasi-war with France, it would have to be Thomas Truxton, the captain of the USS Constellation. He came across in February 1799. He came across the French frigate L'Insurgent. Now, remember, the Insurgent was one of the ones that captured the Retaliation from William Bainbridge. But here, when Truxton came across the Insurgent, as they were approaching to do battle, a gale force squall came up, and it knocked the topmast of the Insurgent down. And the sailors had canvas all over the deck, and the mast was broken, and they were trying to repair that. And during this time, the ship was immovable, and the enemy, the Truxton, Thomas Truxton on the Constellation, was bearing down on them and started firing at their rigging. And as they fired at the rigging, more and more rigging came down, and this was disabling the Insurgent. Couldn't maneuver, and this gave the Constellation full advantage in the battle. I mean, they could basically attack from the bow and then circle around and attack the stern. And the third time that they were coming around to attack the stern, the Insurgent surrendered, because they had damaged rigging and dead men all over the decks of their ship, and they couldn't maneuver to fire back. So the Americans captured the Insurgent and captured over 300 prisoners on board. There were 29 dead, 41 wounded, and 300 prisoners, and they gave it a quick repair at sea, and they sailed it into the British port, and everybody in the port stood up and cheered, and Thomas Truxton just realized that he had become a hero in two countries. Now, during the 1790s, Francisco Dominique Toussaint Louverture but we'll just call him Toussaint for short, was having an on-again, off-again war with France. And he basically, what he was a former slave that had led all the slaves in Haiti in rebellion against the French government. But then the French government changed and became on his side, and then the French government changed again, and he was fighting against the French, and then the French government changed again. Well, we'll just say at the time of the Quasi War, when the United States was fighting against France, so was he. And he was having land battles in Haiti against the French army. Okay? And pretty much America was staying out of it, but in 1799, John Adams decided to support him and opened up trade with Haiti. And then, not really Haiti, because Haiti was officially French, but John Adams traded with Toussaint's government and supported him in his effort, and he actually did beat the French and declared himself governor for life, which lasted 1 year, and so did his life. On November 9, 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte led a coup d'etat overthrew the Directory government in France. Now I think this is the fourth or fifth government that France has had in the last 10 years since the French Revolution. They had the revolutionary government, then they had the Robespierre government, then the National Council was before that, then the Robespierre government, then the Directory government, and then now Napoleon, he's taken over his government, his empire now. He's going to form the empire. And Napoleon, now he had no beef and wanted no part of a war with the United States. And right away he worked to well, he had more problems on his. He had more on his plate than he could handle, and he worked to make nice with the United States and wanted to form a peace treaty as soon as he could. In February 1800, about a year, actually about 53 weeks after the USS Constellation under Commodore Truxton fought against the insurgents, the Constellation, still under Truxton, came upon a large French frigate called the Vengeance. And it was a 50-gun frigate, so it's one of the bigger French ships that they had in their fleet. And now the Vengeance was not looking for a fight. It was on a run. It was full of cargo and passengers. It wanted to avoid action at sea at all costs. But they came upon Truxton and the Constellation, and they had no choice. It took because the Vengeance was trying to avoid the Constellation. It took them all day long for Truxton to catch up to them and engage in battle. And by the time they started the battle, it had gotten dark. And the fight was carrying on in the dark, and the captain of the Vengeance, after 5 hours of fighting, after several hours, the French tried to surrender, but it was dark, and they could not see the signals, and it was too loud to holler, and the French just could not surrender, so they stopped firing, and they pretty much drifted away in the dark, and the Americans couldn't find them for the rest of the night. But by the time they did reach a port, and they ran themselves aground to prevent themselves from sinking, they were beat. The Vengeance it was all they could do to keep it from sinking. And that was the second battle, the second major battle that the USS Constellation had against a major warship in this war. And Thomas Truxton was again declared a major hero in this battle. Okay, now remember, Napoleon took over the French government in November 1799, and he began negotiating in the spring of 1800 with the American President John Adams for peace. And they got things nailed down by the summer, and by September they were able to have a big signing ceremony. You see a picture of the signing ceremony here, which took place on 30 September 1800, the Treaty of Fontaine. And the provisions of that treaty were that France would recognize American neutrality. So if France went to war against Great Britain, Austria, Russia, or anybody else, that they would recognize that America would be neutral and they wouldn't harass America's shipping unless, of course, the American ship was trading with their enemy, and then it was free game to take as a prize. They reestablished normal relationships between France and the United States, and it nullified the Treaty of Alliance the Treaty of Alliance from 1778, and that's a treaty that France expected the United States to jump into any war that they would get into. And since France was getting into so many wars, the Americans didn't want to do that. So they nullified that treaty of 1778. Now, in what was probably the most controversial election of all of American history, Thomas Jefferson was elected president in 1800. Now, it was the Alien and Sedition Acts that Alexander Hamilton pushed through, and that John Adams really paid the price for in that election. Anyways, Thomas Jefferson had very different outlook on the Navy and funding and taxes than John Adams did. Now, Thomas Jefferson, he was an anti-federalist when they were having the constitutional debates, and all the anti-federalists became Republicans. And they had a whole different, they did not want an army or a navy because, you know, having an army, that just leads to tyranny, you know, and having a navy leads to a lot of government expenses. And you have a lot of government expenses, then you have to charge the people a lot of taxes. And if you charge a lot of people taxes, then you have to enforce those tax laws, and that leads to tyranny. It was the same type of tyranny that they had fought the British against. They had fought against the British to end that type of tyranny, and Thomas Jefferson did not want to have any part of leading that. So his idea of the Navy was to cut it down to 13 frigates. All the ships that America had in the Navy by then, all of Stoddert's acquisitions and shipbuilding programs, he wanted to cut it down to 13 ships. And he wanted 7 of those in mothballs, you know, just ready to go but not really maintained or not really fully crewed up. And his idea was a coastal defense with the gunboats going up and down the coast, and not really do anything to protect, or not do much to protect the American ships that were overseas, you know, the merchant ships from being captured overseas. And he just wanted a small gunboat navy to use for coastal defense. By the year 1800, the ink on the United States Constitution was barely dry, and the United States had beaten a world power strictly at sea. My name is John Sorensen, and thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com.